Morning. Just thank you all for joining. We're just letting a few more people into the lobby and we'll be starting the session in a few moments. Thank you. Just letting a few more people into the room. The attendees are moving up quite fast here. Okay. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear okay? Stephen and Hannah, maybe give me a thumbs up. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We're just letting a few more people into the room, but we have quite a few people in the webinar today. I'll do some introductions in a moment, but just wanted to let you know that you're very welcome to the State Aid webinar. Some of you may have heard a little bit of news this morning, but SEUPB internally are dealing with some quite sad news this morning. So we're a little bit fragile, but our colleagues in the Department for the Economy Subsidy Control Unit are going to help us out and deliver the session for us. And we're really grateful for their presence here today. So just to introduce you to the speakers, many of you will know Stephen Moore, who's our guru, and Stephen is the head of the Subsidy Control Unit at the Department of the Economy. And he's also supported by a number of other gurus as well, as I would say, who also offers a lot of help. And we have some really good slides today. So we have Daniel Bunting and we have Hannah Murphy and Damien Montgomery on the session as well today from the Subsidy Control Unit at the Department of the Economy. We're also joined by Paul O'Donnell, who's an associate at KPMG Law. And Paul has worked behind the scenes within SEUPB on some of the state aid and the projects. My name is Deirdre Maguire and you're all very welcome today. So if you just bear with us, we're going to do our very best to take you through this. The webinar, Stephen will give you the brief on exactly what to expect today. It's going to really take you through all the UK and the EU subsidy and control regime legal requirements and clarify some of the roles and responsibilities. Just so you know, the session is recorded and it's going to be available on the support portal afterwards for anybody who needs to dip back in and out of it. Hopefully you'll find that of value. We will have a long session today, so we intend to take a few breaks. The first one will be at 11 o'clock and we'll go from there. Everything is recorded. Please put in your questions and answers into the Q&A box, not into the chat, into the Q&A box. We do anticipate the Q&A will be a busy time, but a great opportunity for you to ask your questions. And finally, SEUPB will be following up with some kind of extra checklists and things in due course. But today, really, it's over to Stephen, and thank you so much, Stephen, for presenting today. Over to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, and thanks, Marianne, as well for organising this. And welcome everybody. And again, just to explain, from a department point of view, this is a fantastic opportunity for us to reach out to folk that we normally don't have the opportunity of meeting in any sort of session. What we are planning to do this morning is hopefully demystify what is meant by EU state aid and the UK Subsidy Control Act. So I'm going to start by hopefully sharing the slides. What I'm also going to do, just to hopefully there will be no issues with the technology, but I'm going to turn off my camera, and hopefully that will helpfully or avoid any problems we might have with connectivity, etc. So turn my camera off, and then let's share these slides. So hopefully, for that. Where are we? There we are. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the first slide there. Anna, you can give me a big thumbs up if that's the case. Thank you very much. Okay. So UK Subsidy Control Act 2022, EU state aid, and the infamous or famous Article 10 of the Windsor Framework. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey here. I'm going to involve sort of how we have got to where we've got to, and try and give you a bit of an understanding of the wonderful world of subsidy control and EU state aid. Our objectives are primarily to raise awareness of the legal requirements of both the UK and the EU subsidy control regimes, with a particular focus on a couple of the state aid rules, the general block exemption regulation, and the EU's de minimis regulation. We're then going to explain the UK Subsidy Control Act 2022, and we'll also be explaining the relevance of Article 10 of the Windsor Framework. And most of you will have heard of the Windsor Framework, but we'll talk a bit about specifically about Article 10 within that. Try and clarify the roles and responsibilities of public authorities, our unit here, and also yourselves as the beneficiary enterprises or the intermediate bodies providing sort of subsidies to SME businesses. What we'll try and do is highlight some of the key differences between the regimes, and we'll also sort of highlight particularly some of the challenges and highlight some of the risks as well that you guys need to be aware of as well. And then we're going to signpost you to further sources of help and assistance should you need it. And as I keep saying to my folk here, you know, there is no such thing as a silly question. Clearly, this is an area of quite a lot of complexity and a lack of clarity. And so anything we can do to help you understand the rules, understand the relevance of the rules, understand the risks, roles and responsibilities, we're grateful that we have this opportunity to do it. So please fire your questions into the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. So why do we have subsidy control rules? Well, I've lifted, these are headlines that I've lifted from various things. You'll see, particularly in the centre there, you'll see Andrew McCormick, who is our permanent secretary whenever the RHI scheme, the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme, had to go through the public inquiry. And I could have shown you a different slide, which was one from the BBC website, which had me sitting in the picture as I was giving evidence to the inquiry. And that was rather an uncomfortable experience that day when I had to give evidence to the inquiry and try to explain to the inquiry my role in the RHI programme and from a state aid perspective what we did. And unfortunately, you know, I think my session at the RHI inquiry went well, but it was definitely one of the most uncomfortable days of my life as a civil servant, and I don't particularly want to go through that experience again. So anyway, the subsidy control rules and the stated rules involve money, They involve subsidies to the businesses. At times, as you can see from some of those headlines, the provision of subsidies can be quite contentious, and as well as being politically contentious, there can be legal disputes about the awarding of subsidies or the compliance of subsidies. So again, in slightly less dramatic form, the purpose of subsidy control is to ensure this balance between the freedom to award financial assistance to achieve public policy objectives and rules which minimize the negative effects of subsidies on domestic and international competition and investment. And you can see there that if subsidies aren't controlled, not only can there these harmful distortions in trade and competition, but also you can have public resources being used ineffectively and inefficiently, which is obviously the case with the RHI programme. What is a subsidy? In the context of the Subsidy Control Act and the stated rules particularly, a subsidy means financial assistance that's awarded by a public authority directly or indirectly to certain selected or specific enterprises that could have an effect, a foreseeable effect on trade, competition, or investment. And as you'll see there in the second bullet point, the World Trade Organization, the EU, and the UK all have slightly different definitions of what is meant by a subsidy as far as their respective legislation is concerned. Examples of a subsidy, some fairly obvious things, a grant to a business, an enterprise, to encourage it to invest in Northern Ireland is clearly a subsidy. Similarly, a grant to encourage a company to undertake research and development. Less obvious is a loan. If you make a loan to a business at less than the market rate of interest, that's a subsidy. But other examples, fairly obvious things would be like energy efficiency grants, grants to an enterprise to build a commercial tourist attraction, repayable grants to a TV or movie production company for the likes of HBO for the production of the Game of Thrones TV series, or some of the large films that have been produced in Northern Ireland. Those are all subsidies. A reduction in the rate of corporation tax paid by businesses in Northern Ireland without a corresponding reduction in the block grant would also be a subsidy, and that's quite we're starting to get to the edge of what is a subsidy and what is not a subsidy at that point. Some other examples which may be less obvious of them being a subsidy would be the sale of public land at less than market rates, the testing or the provision of testing and research services by a public authority at less than market rates, subsidising air routes, central government support to redevelop a publicly owned leisure centre, and one that some of you may be aware of is the redevelopment of the Lakeland Forum Leisure Centre in Enniskillen. It was a subsidy, and in fact that was a subsidy of particular interest, as you'll see later on. A further education college, and I know some of you folk today are from further education colleges. If you were to give free training to the employees of a business that gives that business an economic advantage, that would be a subsidy. And then similarly, grants to public bodies to generate commercial revenues that would reduce its reliance on public funding. Again, that is a subsidy under the meaning of both the stated rules and the Subsidy Control Act. And some people are just waiting to go in there, just let them in. What is not a subsidy? What is not a subsidy is the development of public realm space, and that wouldn't be seen as being a subsidy. Similarly, the development of workspace by a public authority when it's part of its statutory duty to do so, when this is sold or rented out to enterprises at market rates, that wouldn't be a subsidy. Similarly, making public terrain available to build on and ensuring that it's connected to utilities. Again, if that's a statutory responsibility of a public authority, that may not be a subsidy either. And similarly, loans to enterprises in market terms and conditions wouldn't be a subsidy, or funding to further education colleges to upskill or train individuals, where it's not linked to a particular business, that would not be a subsidy. And similarly, apprenticeships is a slightly more complex case, but the traditional view is that when we're funding apprenticeships, that's outside of the scope of the EU stated rules, and the UK Subsidy Control Act. But these are all complex cases, and we're definitely at the margins of what is a subsidy under the legislative frameworks. Interesting just to explore what actually is a public authority and what is an enterprise. Again, a public authority can be many things. Like obviously government departments are usually public authorities, but their partner bodies, the likes of Invest NI, Tourism NI, NI Screen, Intertrade Ireland, SEUPB, and Northern Ireland Councils, they are all public authorities. It gets a little bit difficult when we're looking at bodies like further education colleges, universities, and their relationship with their parent departments is quite complex. But basically, any person that exercises a public function, it can be seen as being a public authority. Again, enterprise, the word enterprise has a specific definition in the UK Subsidy Control Act. And it means a person or a group of persons that engages in an economic activity that entails offering goods or services on a market to the extent that that person is engaged in the activity. So that's a very nuanced legal definition you can see immediately from that. And again, just to highlight as well that in state aid, under EU state aid law, the word undertaking has the same meaning as the word enterprise under UK law. So again, there are slight differences in the way these things are presented in the different regimes. One of the questions we're often asked is what if you have a person that engages in both economic and non-economic activity? For example, a council or a charity or a university, or even in the case here, we have further education colleges as well. So where you have a recipient of financial assistance who engages in both economic and non-economic activity, the UK statutory guidance to the Subsidy Control Act says that the person should only be regarded as being an enterprise in relation to its economic activities. So we fund an organization and that gives them some sort of economic advantages over other commercial entities, then they're considered to be an enterprise in respect of that funding. So examples of that would be, for example, if we had a university that wanted to get funding from us to build student accommodation. Clearly, there are many private providers of student accommodation, and if we fund a university to build student accommodation, which it then rents out, in respect of that funding, the university would be regarded as being an enterprise, and the funding has to comply with the Subsidy Control Act in the UK. So one of the things just to be aware of is that the statutory guidance actually explains that not all financial assistance necessarily meets the test of the person being an enterprise. Where you have an organization that carries out predominantly non-economic activities with a very small amount of ancillary economic activities, and the public authority can conclude that the organization is not an economic entity. And we have some examples of that with the universities, where the universities will be funded to undertake to develop like a centre of excellence, a research centre of excellence, and that centre of excellence will provide use some of its capacity to provide research or testing services to businesses. And in that type of situation, if a very small part of the facility is used for those services and a small amount of the revenues in that facility come from those commercial services, under the stated rules and under the UK Subsidy Control Act, the public authority can conclude that the university is not acting as an enterprise. However, these are quite nuanced cases. They're very fact specific. So you just need to be sure that when you're looking at these types of cases, that the classic phrase comes to mind, that the devil is in the detail. Covered some of that already, so just skip on. So in a picture, this is kind of the situation that we were faced with from a subsidy control perspective. In the background, we have the World Trade Organization Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, and most countries in the world are signed up to very few aren't. North Korea being one example of a country that isn't, but most countries are signed up to this, and they've signed up to the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, which essentially says that if you're providing financial assistance to a company that manufactures goods, there are certain principles you have to comply with, and if you don't do that, then other members of the WTO can effectively ask for a review of your schemes, and we occasionally will get queries from WTO members about some of our schemes. Moving slightly further into the picture, we have the large oval, and you'll see it's UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And some of you may be aware of that. This is the agreement that the UK and the EU signed whenever the UK left the European Union. And this trade agreement has a chapter in it that relates to subsidy control, and sets out principles that both the UK and the EU agree to follow in respect of their separate regimes. And so that then brings me to the two circles. On the left-hand side, we have the EU stated rules. And until the end of 2020, the UK followed those stated rules from whenever it joined the European Union back in 1972. And those EU stated rules obviously still apply to all EU member states, and in the context of SEUPB and PEACEPLUS, any of the projects which are in Ireland have to comply with the EU stated rules. And on the right-hand side, we have the UK Subsidy Control Act, and the UK Subsidy Control Act we will talk about in quite a bit of detail in the second half of this presentation. But the UK Subsidy Control Act came into legal effect and was fully commenced on the 4th of January 2023. So effectively, we now have two regimes that apply in the UK. And this is where the Windsor Framework comes into play. So as you know, whenever the UK left the European Union, to avoid the need to have border control posts and trade controls on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, it was agreed that Northern Ireland and the UK would continue to follow the EU legislation in respect of trade and competition and various other things to do with goods. And by doing so, effectively the border exists between Northern Ireland and Great Britain and the Irish Sea, and there's no hard border on the island of Ireland. So you'll be aware originally that was called the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then there were refinements made to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it was renamed the Windsor Framework under Rishi Sunak's government. And within the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework, Article 10 relates to the stated rules. And essentially, Article 10 is the gateway that determines whether or not the stated rules apply to a financial assistance measure in the United Kingdom, or that financial assistance measure falls under the UK Subsidy Control Act. I've included in here some links to the UK guidance and the EU guidance on Article 10 of the Windsor Framework. And you'll see that in both of those, you have the differing approaches of UK government and to the EU. You'll see the UK guidance is quite extensive, and you'll see that the EU guidance is very sort of legalistic from an EU perspective. So this brings me to PEACEPLUS, and this brings me to this flow chart, which hopefully works in probably hopefully 100% of cases, but hopefully it works for PEACEPLUS, both sides of the border, and it's to help SEUPB understand and identify which regime applies to any particular project, and also is to help SEUPB and you know, folk like Paul in KPMG to decide what is the best approach from the beneficiary's point of view, and also from SEUPB's in terms of how do you comply in terms of compliance with the relative regimes. And we're going to go through this in quite a bit more detail in respect to the stated rules and then the Subsidy Control Act. So we'll keep coming back to this flowchart as we go through. So we start first with the stated rules. And the EU stated rules, as I just explained earlier, only apply now in the United Kingdom whenever the beneficiary undertakings are within the scope of the Northern Ireland Protocol initially, and now the Windsor Framework. And you'll see that these are undertakings, persons that manufacture goods in Northern Ireland or who trade goods from Northern Ireland into the EU, or who produce energy for the wholesale market on the island of Ireland, and farmers and others who engage in primary agricultural or fisheries activities, except in the case of agriculture, whenever Article 10.2 of the Windsor Framework applies. And just very quickly to explain, for those of you who are familiar with the EU stated rules, you probably will remember the Common Agricultural Policy and the income support measures for farmers. That now, because we're no longer a member state in Northern Ireland, that relates to Article 10.2, is effectively the same sort of support mechanism for farmers that would have been under the Common Agricultural Policy. So as far as state aid and general state aid rules are concerned, what we're mostly looking at is Article 10.1 of the Windsor Framework, and that's the bit of the framework that details and tries to clarify when the stated rules apply. And the stated rules are detailed in Annex 5 of the Windsor Framework, the Northern Ireland Protocol. So again, if we look at the decision tree, if we were to follow it through, starting up in the top left-hand corner, we start first by asking, is the beneficiary an enterprise? Is the beneficiary an enterprise or an undertaking engaged in the manufacture of a good? And if the answer is yes, the next question is the funding to enhance the economic activities? Now, normally the answer will be yes, The answer probably would only be no if we were providing the funding in the form of a loan, or if we're providing the funding in the form of equity, and the loan is at a market rate of interest, or the equity is under the same standard terms and conditions that would apply, or the same terms and conditions that other investors are getting whenever they're investing in an entity. So if the funding is going to enhance the economic activities and give the enterprise an advantage over its competitors, we move on to the third question and we ask, is the enterprise located in Ireland or the EU? And if the answer is no to that, if the enterprise is located in Northern Ireland, the next question we have to ask is whether or not the enterprise operates only in the services sector. And if the answer to that is yes, then the financial assistance falls under the UK Subsidy Control Act. So just run through that again. So if an enterprise is located in Northern Ireland, and if the enterprise only operates in the services sector, then it's the UK Subsidy Control Act that applies. So say, for example, you're providing financial assistance to a business like a cafe or a hairdresser, or to a legal practice, something that's offering services in Northern Ireland, then that falls under the UK Subsidy Control Act. Moving back to that third question again, if the enterprise is located in Ireland, or if it's involved in manufacturing, then we're going to be looking at the UK, or looking at the EU stated rules. So if we look at the third question again and we answer it first, so is the enterprise located in Ireland? And the answer is yes. So whether it's involved in manufacturing or services, if it's located in Ireland, then we move on to the question, is the effect of the subsidy purely local? And this highlights one of the differences between the UK regime and the EU stated rules. Under the EU stated rules, the test for whether or not a subsidy is present or not actually applies at the level of the member state. So for something to be subject to the EU stated rules, there has to be a foreseeable effect on trade and competition between member states. So say, for example, we were providing funding to a very small manufacturer or a very small service sector business in Ireland, and that business wasn't going to be exporting its product to the UK, or wasn't going to be offering services to UK customers. In that type of situation, it would be usual to conclude that the effect would be purely local, and the member state can conclude that the measure is not subject to the stated rules. And you'll see in further on this presentation, I've got some links to a document in the European Commission published called the Notion of Aid Communication, and that document sets out some of the legal precedents to determine whether or not that test applies. If we go back to manufacturers now, and manufacturers in Northern Ireland. So again, if we're looking at that third question and we're asking, is the business in Northern Ireland and is it a manufacturer? Again, you'll see that in that particular case, if you were to go through your questions, you end up under the stated rules, and so we have to comply with the stated rules in respect of manufacturing businesses in Northern Ireland. And this is where you can see that you really have to follow this flow chart through in individual cases for individual businesses, trying to identify what does the business actually do and what are they going to do with the monies that, or the support that's being provided indirectly to them. So coming back to the stated rules, if we have determined that the stated rules apply, and the financial assistance has to comply with the stated rules. So just go back to the slide for a minute. We effectively have 4 options under the stated rules. We effectively have the de minimis regulation. We have an option for services of general economic interest. We have the GBER, the General Block Exemption Regulation, and then we have the option of a full notification to the European Union. And this is where we would ask the European Commission in Brussels to approve financial assistance. Normally in Northern Ireland, for anything involving the stated rules, that actually boils down to 2 options: either the General Block Exemption Regulation or the EU de minimis regulation. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about these 2 regulations. And both these regulations, if you follow them, or if SEUPB follow them, then they don't have to ask DG Competition in Brussels for approval to award any financial assistance. So the GBER is the main regulation that applies right across Europe, and the European ambition is that the GBER, the General Block Exemption Regulation, provides legal cover for more than 90% of all the state aid that's awarded by the EU member states. And effectively what it does is it exempts member states from having to ask DG Competition in Brussels for its permission before they award subsidies or state aid to undertakings in the European Union. It has a very broad scope. It covers a vast array, a range of subsidies. So you'll see here, we're going to go through some of those in a few minutes. But again, just because of EU exit, just to highlight that it now only applies to aid in Northern Ireland to manufacturing businesses. In the slide there, you'll see there's a couple of links. The first of those links is to the consolidated text of the GBER itself. The GBER has been amended, I think now 4 times, the current GBER, and the European Commission is actually currently undertaking a further review of the GBER, and there may be further sort of modifications to it in the coming year. But the consolidated text provides SEUPB, ourselves, other public authorities with everything we need to ensure compliance. And then the second link is to the list of Northern Ireland's state aid and subsidy control reference numbers. And within that, for schemes that are registered with the European Commission through their state aid register, there's a link against each individual programme that'll take you to the state aid page on the Commission's website. And so for things that you'll see some of your PEACEPLUS projects that are registered as GBER schemes, you'll see that the link will take you through to the reference on the European Commission state aid register. So in terms of the GBER itself, to comply with the GBER, you first need to comply with the general conditions of the GBER, which are in Chapter 1. And we're not going to go through them in any detail here, but just to flag that to comply with the GBER, you must comply with all these general conditions. And this is where, probably from an SEUPB perspective and your perspective, it's important that you do this so that you don't avoid any issues with the European auditors. So whenever the audit authority monitors the compliance with the state aid rules, the audit authority has a checklist, and this checklist goes through all these conditions in Chapter 1 of the GBER, and then specific conditions for each type of state aid. And the European auditors are supposed to go through this checklist and ensure that when the aid is being granted under the GBER, that it's within the scope, that the likes of SEUPB have complied with all the definitions and the thresholds. They've complied with the transparency obligations for the GBER, and we'll come back to transparency in respect of some of the PEACEPLUS projects and highlight a wee point to do with innovation aid to SMEs in a wee minute. The GBER, the audit authorities will also be checking that there is an incentive effect to the aid, and particularly for SMEs who are applying for any support, state aid support. One of the things that GBER says is that SMEs must actually ask for it. There must be a written application seeking aid before work on the project or the activity actually starts, which will normally be the case, but just to be aware of that. Article 7 then looks at aid intensities and eligible costs. And again, usually in the GBER, the eligible cost will be specified in the GBER. And again, you know, the likes of yourselves and SEUPB, you just need to be sure that whenever you're providing funding under the GBER that you've complied with this. Article 8 relates to accumulation, and there are quite complex rules whenever GBER aid is being combined together or accumulated together with other types of state aid, including de minimis aid. I think for SEUPB, for this PEACEPLUS programme, accumulation is not a particular challenge, because I don't think there should be any accumulation in any of the projects we've seen to date, but it's there, it's a rule that has to be complied with. Article 9 deals with specific rules in publication, and under the GBER and under the UK Subsidy Control Act, transparency is a key thing. The Commission and UK government have committed to being transparent about the subsidies they're awarding. So there are rules on publishing information and schemes. There's rules on publishing information and individual subsidies whenever they're large, and over in the case of EU, whenever they're more than 100,000 euros, or in the case of UK subsidies when they're more than 100,000 sterling. And there are deadlines that have to be met in terms of when information is published on the EU state aid register or on the UK subsidy control database. In the case of EU state aid as well, there are specific requirements in relation to keeping records, and under the EU state aid rules and under the structural investment funds, there are regulations, or there are parts of the regulations say you have to keep records for 10 years from the date when aid was granted or was last granted under a scheme, and that's so that if necessary, state aid can be recovered if it has been found to have been awarded unlawfully. And then when we get into the specifics for different types of aid under the GBER, Chapter 3 then details all the different types of state aid that can be awarded under the GBER and don't have to be approved by the European Commission. So the first of these is Article 14, deals with regional aid, and this is aid for investment in capital assets or in creating new jobs. Article 25 deals with research, development and innovation, and is very heavily used by the likes of Invest NI in particular, and Innovate UK. Article 26 relates to research infrastructures. Article 26A relates to testing and experimentation infrastructures. And then particularly for PEACEPLUS, you'll see that quite a few of the PEACEPLUS programs are making use of Article 28, which relates to innovation aid for SMEs, and we'll come back to that one in a wee minute. Article 31 relates to training aid, although a lot of the PEACEPLUS projects, when we're doing training under PEACEPLUS, it's training for individuals, so it escapes state aid altogether. Article 36 relates to environmental protection, and there's quite a whole swathe of different things now to do with the environment in the GBER. So you'll see Article 36A relates to the recharging and refueling infrastructures, particularly looking at things like electricity and hydrogen. Article 36B relates to the acquisition of clean vehicles or zero emissions vehicles. Article 38 relates to energy efficiency measures other than in buildings. Article 38A then relates to buildings, energy efficiency measures. 38B is energy performance. 39 relates to energy efficiency in the form of financial instruments. So all to do with the environment. Similarly, we've got 41 then looks at renewable energy. 42 looks also at the production of electricity from renewable sources. 43 is looking at things like hydrogen. 44 is looking at environmental taxes. So those are all the environmental provisions. And then just to finish things off, we have Article 50, which is looking at aid to make good damage caused by natural disasters. Article 56 that relates to investment aid for local infrastructures. And then Article 56A that relates to regional airports. Now, some of those ones, actually 56 and 56A, probably now they'll fall mostly under the stated rules in Northern Ireland, but they will still apply, obviously, in Ireland. Just want to have a bit of dive into Article 28, because that is one of the articles that's used in quite a few of the PEACEPLUS projects, and maybe just to give you a wee bit more of an explanation about that. So Article 28 is a very useful article. It allows public authorities to provide support for two things: innovation advisory services and then innovation support services. And you'll see there in the 2 bullet points, I've replicated the EU's definition of what's meant by innovation advisory services and innovation support services. And it is quite a broad definition, and it is something that we have used quite extensively in Northern Ireland and in Ireland in the past. Invest in I and Intertrade Ireland have used this, and quite a few of your SEUPB PEACEPLUS projects are using this definition. So what Article 28 allows is either up to 50% of the eligible costs, or it allows 100% of the costs, up to 100% of the costs for innovation advisory support services, providing that the total amount does not exceed €220,000 per undertaking within any 3-year period. And it's this second bullet point, Article 28.4, that has been extensively used by Invest in I, by Intertrade Ireland, and by many public authorities right across Europe, and is being used to provide cover for your PEACEPLUS projects under the PEACEPLUS programme. So the main thing just to be aware of with Article 28.4 is it looks very similar to EU de minimis aid, and we're going to talk about that in a wee minute, probably just after our comfort break, I think, the way things are going. But you'll see there that before you can award any state aid under Article 28.4, the awarding authority must check how much Article 28.4 aid has been received by this SME within the last 3 years, and that's to ensure that any new Article 28 aid does not cause the SME to exceed this €200,000 ceiling. Now, the important point just to note in respect of this is that, like with EU de minimis, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Article 28 aid only accumulates with other Article 28 aid. So whenever you're signing up an SME to a program, some of the further education colleges are providing testing and support services to SMEs to help them develop new products, and they're providing services for free. But before you can sign them up to that, you have to check, are they receiving any other GBER Article 28 aid from any other public authority? And that will be usually in Northern Ireland, Invest NI or Intertrade Ireland. Very unlikely that it's going to be a council, probably unlikely it's going to be Innovate UK. If it's going to be anybody, it'll be probably Invest NI that will be providing the other Article 28 aid. And when you ask them to check what other support they're receiving from other public authorities, and specifically, is it under Article 28 and if they aren't receiving any other aid, then fine, everything's okay. You can go ahead and you can provide them with the free sort of support to develop new products or services. But that check needs to be undertaken. It needs to be done. Otherwise, whenever if you're unlucky enough to be selected for monitoring by an EU auditor, that's where, unfortunately, the auditors might find an irregularity, and then that leads to complications in drawing down the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund receipts, and causes problems for SEUPB and also yourselves, because you might be, the grant that you're hopefully getting may be put at risk. Another thing just to be aware of with Article 28 is that in 2023, the EU introduced new transparency obligations in relation to Article 28, and this is what happens with the stated rules. The European Union is constantly looking at them, constantly refining them, and in 2023 they introduced this new requirement that if SEUPB or through yourselves, through the FE colleges, that you're providing aid on the basis of Article 28.4 or 28.3 even, you're supposed to comply with 3 conditions. You're supposed to check that the advantage you're giving them is quantifiable and demonstrable, which basically means that you can say what the amount is that you're actually providing them with. So if it's testing services, you need to value that testing services. So if it's so many days of staff time, you actually assign a clear value to it, which you have to do to be able to work out whether or not you exceed the 220,000 ceiling. You also need to, if you're providing services, you need to be public about how much those services are costing, and be clear about your sort of pricing strategy. You can't just magic a number out of the air. There needs to be some clear transparency about what the value of the aid is. And then finally, the service provider, which is obviously in this sort of case will be the likes of an FE college or university. They need to keep records of the amounts of aid that they're granting to each SME, and they need to keep those records for at least 10 years, so that if the EU ever asks, you're able to demonstrate just how much aid has been provided to any particular SME. So that's a new requirement. It's just been introduced in 2023, but again, it's something just to be aware of as we go through. Highlight a few final things just in the GBER. You'll see north and south of the border. One of the particular exclusions is that aid must never be granted to an undertaking in difficulty if it's on the basis of the GBER. So very often this is something that the public authorities overlook, and they just assume the businesses that they're providing assistance to are solvent and are not undertakings in difficulty. But you do need to, as part of your checking before you sign up a business, you do need to have a wee bit of a look at the business. And within the GBER, there actually is a part of it, Article 218 sets out effectively how you test whether or not a business is an undertaking in difficulty. But what we have found with the European auditors is they're quite pragmatic in respect of that, and Invest in I and Intertrade Ireland, as part of their checking process, you just look usually at the company's sort of records, its accounts, just to make sure that it looks like it's a solvent business, and is not in trading difficulties, and usually that satisfies European auditors. Second one is that you're not supposed to award any state aid to any undertakings that are subject to outstanding state aid recovery orders, and I can more or less reassure you that in Northern Ireland you're never going to run into that problem. We don't have any businesses in Northern Ireland that are subject to any outstanding state aid recovery orders, and I'm pretty sure the situation is similar in Ireland. There aren't any businesses that are subject to outstanding state aid recovery orders. The third bullet point is actually relates to international law and to the WTO, and we're not supposed to use state aid, which is contingent on the use of domestic over imported goods. So you can't say a condition of you receiving this aid is that you can only use goods or services bought from, in the case of Northern Ireland, from UK providers, or in the case of Ireland, from Irish providers. So if the beneficiary is in the UK, you can't say you can only buy UK goods, or if the beneficiary is in Ireland, you can't say you can only buy Irish goods. And similarly, if the company is an exporter, you can't subsidize the costs of the company's export activities, which means things like their costs, their labor costs, when they're abroad. Now, these are very specific definitions. I don't think these are going to be issues for any of our SEUPB projects, but again, for completeness, we mention them, and if there's any queries over them, we're more than happy to sort of clarify whether or not it impacts on your project. But in most cases, this would be a very, very, very unlikely. And then finally, we have these publication requirements where member states must publish relevant information on the Commission's Transparency Awards module, or on the state aid webpage, at a national or regional level. And again, SEUPB is complying with those publication requirements, so you don't need to worry too much about that. I'm going to stop at this point because I think we probably will take a wee comfort break, and then we're going to drop into the de minimis rules, if that's okay. And if everybody's happy, we'll reconvene maybe at about 11:05, if that's okay. Grand. See you all in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
So hello again. Hopefully everybody is is back. So just to pick up again, we were talking there before about the general block exemption regulation, and the general block exemption regulation is the main regulation that provides stated cover, and the Commission aims that 90% of all state aid is covered by the GBER. The other regulation which the Commission uses extensively to provide stated cover is the de minimis regulation. I'll just go through to it. Is the de minimis regulation, and this entered into force. The current de minimis regulation entered into force on the 1st of January 2024. Some of you may remember in the past that the previous de minimis regulation provided stated cover for up to 200,000 de minimis. And maybe just to sort of explain briefly what de minimis is. De minimis is quite a strange sort of concept, and it's quite different to the GBER in many respects. So under the de minimis regulation, any company can receive up to the ceiling of 300,000 de minimis aid for anything, absolutely anything, apart from a couple of exclusions to do with exporting, and providing it's within the scope of the de minimis regulation. So the general de minimis regulation. So if you wanted to, say, for example, if you wanted to buy, the employees in a business, if you're in Ireland, if you wanted to buy them a car, you could. The de minimis regulation also has no aid intensity limits on it. So say you wanted to fund up to 100% of an R&D project, or if you wanted to fund up to 100% of a training project, unlike with the GBER, where you would have specific eligible costs and you would have specific aid intensities, under the GBER there are no limits at all, other than the ceiling of 300,000. You can also give de minimis aid to a business that is in difficulty. So if a business has financial difficulty, you can give them de minimis aid. So de minimis aid is actually quite useful. It's a very useful tool for providing cover for things that are otherwise hard to provide cover for under the GBER. So we'll use de minimis quite heavily in a lot of cases where it's a small amount of aid, where it's quite difficult to actually quantify the rules, or it's quite difficult to come up with specific rules on that aid. And we'll give de minimis aid when situations like, for example, if there's been a flooding situation where we need to give money to businesses that may be in financial difficulty quite quickly, we'll use the de minimis regulations to do that, and that's right across Europe. So it's a rule that's very popular amongst member states. But alongside using with any regulation, there are obligations in terms of complying with the specific rules within that regulation. So the main thing we need to do is we need to check before we award any de minimis aid that we're not going to push the enterprise above this 300,000 ceiling over the 3-year period. And that's why we very often, this is referred to as a de minimis declaration. And we have to ask the company how much other de minimis aid have they received in the previous 3-year period, starting with the date you propose to award the new de minimis aid. And then you have to ask them to declare any other de minimis aid they've received in that period, and then you have to check before you allow them into the programme or you award them new de minimis aid that you're not going to push them over this 300,000 ceiling. And that's the one thing that the auditors will be checking for if they ever audit your programme. And we have in the past, both in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, run into problems with this with the European auditors, where the European auditors have gone out to, for example, a local council. They've asked the local council to demonstrate to them that they have complied with this checking obligation, and the local council has not been able to demonstrate to the auditor's satisfaction that they have been doing this checking. And then that has caused us issues with drawing down ERDF receipts under the structural investment funds programs. So some of your programs operate under de minimis, and therefore it's important that you follow the guidance that's being provided by SEUPB, or your own how you do want to administer it yourselves, to ensure that you're checking before you award or sign up a company into these programs that they're not going to exceed this 300,000 de minimis ceiling. The other thing just to check as well is that the companies, when they're making these declarations, are only declaring de minimis aid, and they're not declaring regular state aid grants that would be awarded on the basis of the GBER, for example. De minimis only cumulates with de minimis in the same way that Article 28.4 GBER aid only cumulates with Article 28.4 GBER aid. And it sounds complicated, but actually it's straightforward when you get into the detail of it. And it's just trying to make sure that whenever you're communicating this to SMEs or the others who are receiving de minimis aid, that they understand what they need to declare and what they don't need to declare. And that's something that is often a problem whenever people are administering these programs and they're not familiar with the stated rules, they're not familiar with this particular detail, and usually companies aren't familiar with it. So that's where they get confused as well. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the way the law works. The other thing just to highlight with de minimis is that there are actually three other de minimis regulations. These cover primary agricultural activities, farming that is, fisheries and aquaculture, and then finally services of general economic interest. Now, for the PEACEPLUS programme, you should not ever be running up against those other de minimis regulations. I think most of the beneficiaries will only fall under the general de minimis regulation. But if you do, if you're told that the SME has received primary agricultural de minimis, that's where you should really be coming back to the SEUPB and getting a little bit of clarity as to what you should do in that type of situation. To be honest with you, I think very often that type of thing is easily explained whenever there's a wee bit of investigation. It could be, for example, that the company has made a mistake, there may be, usually there's a separate company that's involved with farming activities, and it's not linked to the company that's actually receiving general de minimis regulation aid. But these are sort of things that you may run across, and in situations like that, the best thing to do is to contact SEUPB and seek clarity on what the best approach would be, because we don't want, and you don't want either, there to be an issue with European auditors picking up these sorts of things, because that can lead to, as I said before, these irregularities, and irregularities usually involve suspensions of payments, which nobody wants. Just going to close off a few things to do with the stated rules. You might hear of things like the Clean Industrial Deal Framework, the CSAF. This is a new state aid rule which has come in and allows member states of the EU to provide aid to technologies that are going to help decarbonize Europe. It's not going to apply within the PEACEPLUS programme, but it is something that people may mention. And in some of the councils, you might hear this mentioned because it will come up in the context of city deals and other big projects. And finally, here we've got some links to the EU state aid landing pages and other things to do. The notion of aid communication I mentioned earlier on, the consolidated text of the GBER and the current de minimis regulation. There are links through to all those regulations. And finally, I've mentioned auditors quite a few times, so I just thought I would give you a quick sort of slide, a couple of slides just to show you the sort of things that EU auditors do pick up in relation to state aid. You'll see here that this is from a European Court of Auditors special report where they highlighted the aid errors, the state aid errors that had a financial impact, which means a loss of EU structural funds, and this is where aid has to be recovered usually, and then other errors that didn't have a financial impact, which were coloured blue, and you'll see there that things like the monitoring of formal requirements not met. This is where, for example, the councils weren't completing their de minimis declarations, and that's the sort of errors that the EU auditors were picking up. And the auditors have continued doing this, and here's an example from 2021. You'll see the Court of Auditors report there, and you'll see that they found various infringements of rules, and you'll see that 18% of the errors came from infringements with the state aid rules. And there's an example of one in Hungary. Nobody ever wants to be singled out as an example in an EU Court of Auditors report, but in Hungary they were found to be not complying with the state aid rules, and then they also mentioned other state aid errors in Portugal and Poland. So you don't want ever to be mentioned in a EU Court of Auditors report. So moving on then to the Subsidy Control Act, the new kid on the block. The UK Subsidy Control Act, if you're going through your flowchart again, you'll see that if the beneficiary is an enterprise and the funding is to enhance economic activities, if the enterprise is not located in Ireland or the EU and is located in Northern Ireland or Great Britain, and in Northern Ireland, if the enterprise operates only in the services sector, then that's when the UK Subsidy Control Act only applies. So I live in Doak in Northern Ireland. I frequently sort of use examples of businesses in the village here. We have various businesses in Doak. We have a car repair place, Blair's Auto Repairs, and we have hairdressers, a couple of hairdressers. We have the Eurospar in the centre of the village with McConnell's Pub. And most of these businesses are all service sector activities. And so if any subsidies are being provided to these businesses by Invest in I, Intertrade Ireland, Antrim and Newton Abbey Borough Council, I would expect that those subsidies would pretty much all have to comply with the UK Subsidy Control Act. So, Subsidy Control Act, it fully commenced in the 4th of January 2023, and sort of history to it is that when the UK left the European Union at the end of 2020, the UK government then consulted on its own subsidy control regime, taking back control from Brussels. End of June 2021, the UK government published a bill in Parliament that made its way through the parliamentary process, and in April 22 received royal assent, and then during the remainder of 22, UK government produced statutory guidance on the Act and various pieces of secondary legislation. And then on the 4th of January, they fully commenced the UK Subsidy Control Act. So from the 4th of January onwards, all subsidies in Northern Ireland must either comply with the UK Subsidy Control Act when they relate to services, or the state aid rules whenever they relate to manufacturing or electricity production. And again, just to sort of complete things from a legal picture, if you were to go into the Act, you'll find in section 48.3 the text that relates to Article 10 of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework. So this is the bit of the Act that says that whenever the subsidies apply in Northern Ireland or to businesses in Northern Ireland within the scope of Article 10, then they have to follow the stated rules. One of the big differences between the UK Act and the stated rules is that there is no approval authority, unlike under the stated rules where you have DG Competition in Brussels that is responsible for monitoring and policing and taking decisions in respect of stated rules, and is responsible for drafting and bringing forward regulations like the de minimis regulation and the general block exemption regulation, and is an approval authority. Under the UK Act, it's closer to the WTO, and it's a principles-based regime. There is no public authority that has any responsibility for approving subsidies that are awarded. So it's a self-policing regime. So SEUPB does its analysis. If it concludes it's a subsidy under the UK Act and SEUPB is satisfied that the subsidy or the scheme complies with the Subsidy Control Act, it can then go on to award the subsidy without having to ask anybody else for approval. The only time an external body actually comes into the mix is whenever it's a very large subsidy, or the scheme can award very large subsidies. And these are subsidies in the case of certain sensitive sectors of more than 5 million, or generally more than 25 million. So extremely unlikely that any of the PEACEPLUS projects are ever going to be caught by this. But in that type of situation, when the subsidies are very large, the compliance assessment of the public authority must be referred to authorities subsidy advice unit for review before it can be legally awarded. And actually the subsidy can't be awarded until 5 days after the subsidy advice unit has published a report on the compliance assessment. We'll talk a bit about more of those in a wee minute. I'll show you some of the examples in Northern Ireland. And then in terms of enforcement, the only way the UK regime is enforced is by an interested party asking the Competition Appeal Tribunal to review the making of a scheme or the awarding of a subsidy, if it's a standalone subsidy, within 1 month, within 1 calendar month. So you can see there, it's a very, very different regime. The CMA's role is to monitor the regime, but it's a light touch. It's not like the EU stated rules. So you're not going to get any sort of UK auditors asking, asking very detailed questions about UK subsidy control compliance. Although clearly that the likes of Northern Ireland Audit Office might ask those sorts of questions, but it's not to the same degree as the European auditors. So in determining, when we're looking at subsidy control under the UK Act, first thing we need to do is to determine whether or not the financial assistance is a subsidy. Second thing we need to do is to determine whether or not it falls under the UK Act or the stated rules. If it is a UK subsidy, we just need to check then there are no prohibitions or conditions in the Act that apply to the scheme of the subsidy. We need to check, which is unlikely in the case of PEACEPLUS, whether or not the scheme is a scheme of particular interest, and if so, needs to be reviewed by the CMA Subsidy Advice Unit. And if we're satisfied with all those sort of points, then we can consider our 4 compliance options. And similar to state aid rules, we have 4 options. We have a principles approach, we have minimal financial assistance, MFA, which is very similar to EU de minimis. We have streamlined routes, which are special schemes which UK government has set up. And then we have services of public economic interest. Now, again, in the context of PEACEPLUS, normally we're looking at the principles approach, and there's possibilities it might be MFA as well, but in probably in most of the cases in PEACEPLUS to date, the way forward has been to comply with the principles, and we'll talk about it more about those in just a wee minute. Having decided what our approach is, the final legal commitment for a public authority under the UK Subsidy Control Act is to publish information on the scheme or the individual subsidy that's being awarded on the UK Subsidy Transparency Database. And that has to be done within 3 months of awarding a subsidy or making a scheme. So first check, is the subsidy present? Again, very similar to stated rules. There's a 4-limbed test that has to be gone through. Is the assistance given directly or indirectly from public resources by a public authority? So usually directly is fairly obvious, it's the giving of a grant. Indirect will be the providing of a service for free, which is often the case in some of the PEACEPLUS projects. Limb B then is 2 parts. Limb B1 relates to whether or not the financial assistance is given to persons or bodies that constitute an enterprise. And these are persons or bodies that are engaging in economic activities in respect of the funding that's being provided. Now, this is the one area where there will be quite a bit of discussion, and there has been quite a bit of discussion already amongst, with ourselves and SEUPB and with KPMG, and also with some of the yourselves as to whether or not subsidies are present. And this is a legal test, and unfortunately under the UK Subsidy Control Act, there's very little legal precedent on yet to sort of go, but we have to make a determination as to whether or not Limb B1 is passed and whether or not the persons are actually enterprises. If they are enterprises, we then go on to consider, does that financial assistance confer an economic advantage? And this is Limb B2. And in most cases, that's fairly evident. The only case where there would be no economic advantage conferred would be if we were providing the financial assistance in the form of a loan at a market rate, or if it was equity on market terms and conditions. In relation to Limb C then, usually with programs like PEACEPLUS, this test is met because the financial assistance benefits one or more enterprises over others. It's specific to selected businesses, and therefore it's not a general measure that applies to all businesses. So Limb C is usually met. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there is a difference between the UK regime and the EU stated rules. Under the stated rules, Limb D applies at the level of member states. There must be a clear, foreseeable effect on trade and competition between member states. However, under the UK regime, when it went through Parliament, MPs decided that threshold in the UK would be much, 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 much lower, and any measure which has even a local effect on trade and competition in the UK regime is a subsidy. So coming back to my examples before, as I said, I live in Doak, just outside Ballyclare in County Antrim. Within Doak we have a couple of hairdressers, and those hairdressers are in competition with other hairdressers in Ballyclare, neighbouring villages, Parkgate, Ballyrobert, so Templepatrick, all the villages nearby, they're in competition. The hairdressers are all in competition with each other. And if we provide financial assistance, or if Antrim and Newton Abbey Borough Council provide financial assistance to the hairdressers in Doak, maybe by giving them a new shop signage or giving them a new high efficiency boiler or solar panels on the business, etc., that is sufficient to pass the test for a subsidy under the UK Act. But it wouldn't be under the stated rules. Okay, so you couldn't imagine, for example, if you were to support a hairdresser in, say, Dundalk, that the people from Doak would be traveling to Dundalk to get their hair done. It's just not really conceivable that people would be traveling so far for that type of thing. And certainly with this is one of the big challenges with the UK regime, that people don't realise that there is such a difference between the UK regime and the stated rules, and that so many more businesses are now caught by the UK Subsidy Control Act than ever would have been caught by the stated rules. So if a subsidy is present, if you pass all 4 limbs, as mentioned before, you have 4 options. Option 1, you have to comply with the 7 principles in Schedule 1 of the Act, and we're going to go through those in a wee minute. Secondly, we have the option of minimal financial assistance, which is very, very similar to EU de minimis under the UK Act. Same approach. Any company can receive up to 315,000 MFA from any public authority in the UK within a 3-year period. Slight differences between the EU stated rules in terms of the ceiling. UK Act 315, UK de minimis is 300,000 euros. Under the UK Act, it's a 3 financial year period, the elapsed part of the current financial year and the 2 previous financial years, whereas under the stated rules, it's a rolling 3-year period based on the date of the awarding of de minimis aid. So slight differences. Thirdly, then we have these streamlined routes, and currently there are 3 streamlined routes for research, development, innovation, energy, and local growth. These are kind of special scheme rules. We haven't made extensive use of them in Northern Ireland to date, mostly because these types of measures usually apply to manufacturing businesses, which still fall under the stated rules. However, there are 2 new streamlined routes being developed, one for arts and culture, the other one for local regeneration, and it's possible that those will be more applicable in Northern Ireland when they're adopted later on this year. The UK government is developing them at the minute. And then finally, we have rules for services of public economic interest. And again, in Northern Ireland, it'd be rare for the likes of PEACEPLUS, SEUPB to come across that rule. It's rarely used in Northern Ireland. The main thing that's being supported as a service of public economic interest is the air route from City Derry Airport to Heathrow that's operated by Loganair, and that's subsidised by the council through a contract with Loganair, with funding coming from the Department for Transport and the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. We have a few other things just to be aware of. In the UK Subsidy Control Act, there's an energy and environmental provisions in Schedule 2. So the scheme or subsidy relates to energy and the environment. There are certain rules that have to be complied with in Schedule 2 of the Act. And then, similar to state aid, there are transparency obligations in respect of schemes and subsidies. So we have to upload information to the subsidy control database within 3 months of a scheme being made or a subsidy award of more than 100,000 being awarded. And again, that's probably not going to impact on you directly, but will impact on SEUPB, and you know, they will work with us to ensure that compliance, that obligation is complied with. And then finally, public authorities like SEUPB must have regard to the UK statutory guidance whenever they're designing a scheme or awarding a standalone subsidy. So I've mentioned these 7 principles because they're quite important, and some of your schemes in PEACEPLUS are designed to comply with these principles, and they are straightforward. In the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the agreement between the UK and the EU, if you were to go into the subsidy control chapter of that, you'll see that there are actually 6 principles, and those 6 principles are principles A to E and principle G in the UK Act. And in the UK Act, they've added the 7th principle, which here is detailed as principle F. And this is where this relates to competition and investment within the United Kingdom. And again, we've highlighted this difference between the EU stated regime and the UK Subsidy Control Act. So if we go through them, the first principle, principle A, is that we should only be awarding subsidies that pursue a specific policy objective that remedies an identified market failure or addresses an equity rationale, which relates to things like social disadvantage. So in the case of PEACEPLUS, usually we've got a market failure where businesses will not engage in R&D, or they'll not engage in training because they don't feel as if they can capture all the rewards of the R&D. But we want to encourage them to do more R&D, because companies that do more R&D tend to be more productive. They tend to end up after the R&D having better jobs which pay better wages, are more sustainable. Similarly, with green measures, with energy efficiency, with renewable energy, quite often companies underinvest in energy efficiency, underinvest in renewable energy, because the costs of the equipment are so high, and they don't, obviously the financial returns aren't great enough to incentivize companies to invest, and subsidies are needed to incentivize them to do that. So you can see there that in terms of compliance with the 7 principles, if you get principle A correct when you're designing your subsidy, usually everything tends to fall in behind quite smoothly and straightforwardly. Principle B, moving on down, the subsidies must be proportionate and limited to the minimum necessary to achieve the policy objective, and that's just old-fashioned value for money. Most people will understand when you go through a business case process, that's the whole point of going through that business case process, to minimize the costs and ensure that what we are providing funding for is the minimum to achieve the policy objective. Principle C, when we're providing subsidies, they should actually change the economic behavior of the beneficiaries. So, for example, SMEs, whenever they're getting support or services for free to develop new products or processes, the counterfactual should always be they just wouldn't do it without the subsidy being provided or the service being provided. SMEs just wouldn't engage with an FE college to develop those new products and processes and pay sort of fees to an FE college or a university to help them develop a new product or process. So that's that additionality test. Principle D is that we should never be paying compensation for costs that a beneficiary would have funded in the absence of a subsidy, unless it's in exceptional circumstances, like a situation of flooding or some other natural disaster. And again, usually with the likes of programs, your PEACEPLUS program, that's fairly obvious that we're not doing that. We're not paying a company's day-to-day running costs. We're paying them for something additional, extra, that they wouldn't normally do. Principle E is that the subsidies must be an appropriate policy instrument to achieve or appropriate instrument to achieve the policy objective, and that the policy objective cannot be achieved through other less distortive means. So what that really means is, for example, again, R&D or energy efficiency, you could legislate in the case of energy efficiency, and you could say that, buildings must be built to a certain building standard, and, that must be to a certain, must have certain level of ventilation or must have a particular heating system. In England, they're talking at the minute about, changing the building regulations to effectively outlaw gas and oil-fired heating systems, forcing people to use electric. But normally in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, it usually the most logical way and rational way of achieving the policy objective is to provide some sort of financial assistance directly or indirectly to achieve the policy objective, be that more R&D, be that better trained employees, be that energy efficient boilers or renewable heating systems. Principle F, when designing a program, the likes of SEUPB must consider what is the effect of this program going to be on competition and investment within the United Kingdom, if it's in Northern Ireland, and must, if possible, design this in such a way to minimize those negative effects. And that means looking at, for example, my hairdresser case, it seems like, a fairly minor case, but it illustrates the point. If you're going to provide funding that's going to benefit a couple of hairdressers in Doak, well, what impact is that actually going to have on the other hairdressers in Ballyclare and Ballyrobert, Parkgate, Templepatrick, etc.? And you must have a look at the market that you're going to be providing your service to, or the local area. And a good example of how this is done was Fermanagh and Omagh District Council, whenever they were looking at the compliance assessment for the redevelopment of the Lakeland Forum Leisure Centre. They looked at the market. They looked at all the different businesses, hotels, gyms, cafes, all around the local area that actually do, to one extent or another, compete with the Lakeland Forum Leisure Centre. They did an assessment of what the impact of the new leisure centre was going to be on all those different businesses, and they concluded that it would have an impact, but it wasn't really going to be a significant impact. And then finally, Principle G is that the good that we are going to do with the subsidy in terms of achieving our policy objectives outweigh any negatives, in particular negatives effects on competition and investment, and in particularly in the likes of the Lakeland Forum Leisure Centre case. That was a good example where the council did a really good job, really impressed the Competition and Markets Authority with how well they had understood the impact their subsidy was going to have on the local market, and had balanced up and had satisfied itself that the positives the redevelopment of the Lakeland Forum Leisure Centre were going to bring about far outweighed any of the potential negative effects of redeveloping the leisure centre. I've mentioned the CMA subsidy advice unit a number of times. Like, they're not going to come into play in the PEACEPLUS case, but again, you may come across them in other sort of areas. The local councils are very aware of them from the levelling up projects and the city deals they're currently going through the system, and the CMA will have a role in some of those. The CMA only provides advice to public authorities in relation to these subsidies of particular interest, and it also monitors the operation of the UK regime. And next year, 2026, it's going to publish its first monitoring report on how well the regime is actually operating. I've mentioned these subsidies of particular interest before, and I've mentioned the Lakeland Forum case quite a bit this morning. You'll see that in Northern Ireland to date, there have been 5 subsidies of particular interest. Lakeland Forum, which was a levelling up project, and then you'll see 3 city deals projects, the Mourne Mountain Gateway project, which some of you might have been aware of and has featured in the news quite a bit. The Gobbins Phase 2 project, and the I4C Innovation Clean Tech Centre in Ballymena, And then the final one is this operating subsidy that goes to City of Derry airport operations, and that subsidises the running costs of the airport up in the northwest. In terms of the subsidy control database, this, again, you're probably not going to be impacted by this too much through PEACEPLUS, but all subsidies that are over a particular value have to be uploaded to this database, and you can access that and look up subsidies on effectively businesses and right across the UK. There's a time limit for doing this, which UK government is quite keen that we all adhere to, and so we have to make sure that we comply with this 3-month time limit. And it's important as well, because not just because it's a legal requirement, but also because once you have uploaded the information on the scheme or the subsidy to the database, that effectively starts the 1-month calendar period for interested parties to challenge the making of a scheme or the awarding of a subsidy. And if they don't challenge before the end of that 1-month period, the window closes. And in theory, they shouldn't be able to challenge the making of the scheme or the awarding of a subsidy unless they can prove some sort of exceptional circumstances. The UK Act is currently been in operation since, as I said, the 4th of January 23. We're 2.5 years into the Act now, and UK government has just made some refinements to it. They've refined the subsidy of particular interest threshold upwards. For the general subsidy, it's moved from 10 million to 25 million. They've also improved the database slightly by removing some of the duplication which was in it, and they've started work to develop these streamlined routes for arts and culture and community regeneration, which you might hear more about in the autumn. I've mentioned as well that there's very little case law on subsidy control. There have been 2 cases, effectively, or 2 cases to date under the Competition Appeal Tribunal and 1 case under the General Court. So the Durham judgment and that case clarified that a public authority cannot give a subsidy to itself. So that was quite a useful case. And then we had another one in the CAT, which relates to a property developer, Aubrey Weiss, who was unhappy with Greater Manchester Combined Authority awarding loans to one of his competitors, and he challenged the making of those loans and tried to argue they didn't comply with the commercial market operator principle, but he was unsuccessful. And then we have the Bulb case, which is quite a complex case, where it was being brought by a group of businesses, and it was against the takeover, trying to effectively unwind the takeover of Bulb Energy by Octopus Energy, and again that was unsuccessful. And then there are 2 cases which are currently going through the CAT. First of those is the new lottery company against the Gambling Commission, and again that relates to a 70 million grant to Camelot, which the new lottery company, which was in competition with Camelot to run the National Lottery, allegedly is saying that it gives Camelot an unfair advantage. So they're looking to effectively unwind that competition. And then finally, which is much more conventional from a subsidy control perspective, is the case which Bristol Airport are bringing against Welsh Government. Welsh Government owns Cardiff Airport, and basically it's in competition, as some of you might be aware, with other airports, Birmingham and Bristol in particular. and Bristol Airport are alleging that the subsidy package which the Welsh Government provides to Cardiff it doesn't comply with the Subsidy Control Act, and it'll be very interesting to see how that case actually concludes. Just very quickly, I'm going to deal with some of the practical challenges. The first one, these are really things for the likes of SEUPB and for the beneficiaries whenever you're developing your proposals to consider is the actual financial assistance a UK subsidy or state aid? And that is the area of work where we find constantly we're being asked questions. It is the most difficult area. It's very fact specific. We're in discussions constantly about whether or not a UK subsidy is present or state aid. Now, in the department here, we don't provide legal advice. As I've mentioned before, it's up to the public authority to make that determination. But we are trying to help the public authorities take that view. It's difficult as well for legal colleagues out there because there's very little legal precedent for the UK Subsidy Control Act to follow. There's more precedent for state aid, but it's challenging at times determining whether or not financial assistance is actually present. And within that, there's a particular challenge about how you determine whether or not a beneficiary is an enterprise. When is an enterprise and when is it not? I've mentioned the effect and trade test in the UK and LIMD, and when is there no effect on UK trade and investment is often the question that comes up. Truthfully, the advice from DBT, the Department for Business and Trade, is that LIMD is passed in almost every situation. It will be an extremely rare case whenever LIMD isn't passed. And go back to my hairdresser example, if a hairdresser is getting subsidy in Doak, the mere fact that it's in competition with hairdressers a mile down the road in Ballyclare is sufficient to pass the LIMD test. One of the challenges for the likes of SEUPB and others and councils is whenever you're going down the principles route, how much do you need to do? When is the depth of the compliance assessment commensurate with the subsidy and the potential distortive impact of the subsidy? The UK statutory guidance is very unclear about what the depth of the compliance assessment needs to be, other than it says you need to look at it and the compliance assessment needs to be commensurate with the risk. So if there's a risk of a challenge, if there's a clearly obvious risk of a challenge, for example, if you're awarding a subsidy to the likes of an airline like Loganair, the airline sector is notoriously litigious, and there are numerous state aid examples where airlines have challenged the awarding of subsidies to their competitors. So in that type of case, you would want a much more in-depth compliance assessment. However, going back to my hairdresser example in Doak, something like that, it's probably very unlikely that there's a risk of other hairdressers trying to take a case with the subsidy control, with the Competition Appeal Tribunal, or even complaining. So with something like that, you can have a much lighter touch approach, and you can demonstrate compliance with the principles without having to spend a significant amount of time and money in getting a compliance assessment prepared. In terms of demonstrating compliance, I think some of the lessons that have come out of the CMA reports have related to Principle A in particular. And again, if you get Principle A right, everything else tends to fall into place. So one of the things that the CMA has highlighted is that your evidence of market failure or the equity rationale needs to be up to date. It needs to be clear and up to date evidence. One of the criticisms of the compliance assessment for the City of Derry airport subsidy of particular interest was that the evidence was a bit dated. So the evidence of market failure was a bit dated in that case, and they thought it should have been updated. So we take that one away, and it's a lesson to be learned for next time. The other thing is that there needs to be a clear sort of linkage between the policy objective that you're trying to achieve and the market failure. The policy objective must be remedying the market failure. There's no point in giving a grant to an SME, which is notionally to improve the SME's productivity, if you don't actually know how it's going to improve the productivity of the SME. So that needs to be thought through whenever you're doing a compliance assessment. How does the engine actually work? And coming back to SEUPB programs and the differences between stated rules and the Subsidy Control Act, under the stated rules, everything is prescriptive. It either falls within a regulation or it doesn't. And if it doesn't fall within the regulation, then you have to find another means of providing state aid cover. So very often what happens is if we look at the stated rules, we'll look at the general block exemption regulation, we'll see if that provides cover for a scheme or for a particular subsidy. And if it doesn't, then we'll have to see, could we then provide that subsidy or scheme on the basis of the EU's de minimis regulation, or do we have to fully notify the European Commission and ask them to approve the subsidy? Under the UK regime, which is a principles-based regime where there are no rules like the GBER, it's purely based on the principles. And very often, you know, if you can demonstrate compliance with the principles, that's all you need to do. It's a self-assessment. You don't need to refer to the CMA. You probably don't even need to publish information because the subsidies are quite low. And in that type of situation, I would argue that it's better to go down the principles route than to go down the minimal financial assistance route. And the reason for that is because there's quite a bit of administration involved with MFA, where you have to do this checking like you do under de minimis, asking the enterprises how much other MFA they received in the current and 2 previous financial years. And that admin is prone to errors, and it's nugatory work for the public authority, and also for the business as well. And in that particular case, so you'll see, for example, in some of the SEUPB programs that on the Subsidy Control Act side, for the service sector businesses, it's a compliance assessment and it complies with the principles. But on the EU state aid side, it's going down an Article 28(4) route, or it's going down a de minimis route, because it has to fit within the scope of a regulation. And that's why you have that difference in approach between UK Subsidy Control Act and state aid. It's purely to make it easier for the businesses, purely to make it easier for yourselves and SEUPB, and hopefully that explains the thinking behind that and the logic that applies. Finally, in terms of practical challenges, again, shouldn't be an issue with SEUPB. In this case, hopefully, where you have more than one public authority providing funding to your project, these are related subsidies, and that creates complexities because you have to make sure that you're not sort of running over any accumulation sort of ceilings. So, for example, we've had some of the projects in the past in city deals where you've got more than, so city deals, you've got the city deals money and then local council money going into your project, or you've got other bodies, like we've got projects where the Heritage Lottery Fund is providing funding alongside Northern Ireland Civil Service departments and local councils as well, and that type of thing, where you've got many public authorities providing funding to a single project. That creates significant challenges and complications. Moving on then, just very quickly to finish up, we have the roles and responsibilities. So public authorities like SEUPB have a legal duty to determine whether or not subsidies are present and which regime applies. They have to have due regard to UK guidance and ensure that they are complying with that guidance. They have to provide the information that has to be uploaded to the EU or the UK databases. And they also have to respond to any inquiries or legal challenges within the required timescales. And if required, they have to recover subsidies from the beneficiaries. Beneficiaries themselves, well, they obviously, the SMEs and in the likes of these PEACEPLUS programs, their main duty is to use the subsidy for the purpose intended. So if they're getting services to develop a new product, they should really be developing that new product. And they shouldn't be, sort of like using it for other purposes. And beneficiaries also, if they're required, need to provide the de minimis declaration information or the minimal financial assistance information to ensure that the ceilings aren't exceeded. Our role in the department here is to provide awareness like this today and to provide practical advice and assistance. We also provide the Northern Ireland input to EU and UK reporting and monitoring exercises. And we're the local administrator for the UK and the EU reporting and notifying systems, the state aid notification systems and the UK subsidy control database. We don't provide legal advice. Our colleagues in the Department Solicitor's Office do that. And the likes of councils will take their own private legal advice. And SEUPB, as you're aware, are getting some advice in these projects from KPMG. The do's and the don'ts, again, we always say this, start early. The earlier you start, the better. Before you write a business case, you should be thinking about subsidy control compliance. I would argue if you think about subsidy control before you start your business case, it'll make a better business case. The business case will be better for it. You do need to refer to the guidance and state aid and subsidy control to try and understand the requirements. You should seek advice from ourselves, or if it's to do with agriculture, from our colleagues in DERA. If it's down south, seek advice from DETE and the state aid unit down there. And the other thing you should do is document everything, because you never know whenever a challenge is going to be made. And particularly if your conclusion is that state aid or subsidy, UK subsidy, isn't present, and that's when you really do need to detail quite clearly how you arrived at that conclusion, and when you arrived at that conclusion. And in the Greater Manchester case, there was a lot of time and effort was spent looking at the processes Greater Manchester Combined Authority went through before it awarded the loans to the property developer. And that turned to be crucial in determining that sort of process the Greater Manchester went through, that they were able to explain clearly to the Competition Appeal Tribunal was ultimately what resulted in the CAT siding with Greater Manchester Combined Authority and concluding that they hadn't awarded the loans unlawfully. In terms of the don'ts, don't ignore it. Don't make it a tick box exercise. Most people who understand this and take advice from ourselves, understand that and certainly don't make it a tick box exercise. But occasionally, people do ignore it, but they really shouldn't. And then finally, just again, I can't emphasize this enough, when you're doing a compliance assessment, start early. If you ever had to notify the European Commission, or if you have to go to the CMA with a subsidy of particular interest, the process for doing that takes 6 to 12 months or longer. So the earlier you start, the better. You need to remember as well that public authorities like SEUPB are legally responsible for ensuring compliance, and it's the accounting officers in SEUPB will be held to account if there are non-compliance is found. And as I've mentioned before a number of times, with European auditors, if they discover any irregularities, then usually that results in ERDF or ESF receipts having to be pulled from the system until such times as those irregularities can be addressed. And then finally, hopefully it'll never happen, but if required, public authorities must recover unlawful UK and EU subsidies if they're ordered to do so by, in the case of the UK, by a court or the Competition Appeal Tribunal, or in the case of the EU state aid, by the European Commission or a European court. Further information, some links to our web pages, the UK web pages, Competition and Markets Authority Subsidy Advice Unit, and the EU stated rules. And I've just given you our email address for any queries, so you can fire that to us at any stage. And I'm just going to stop sharing at this point, and I think Dan has just messaged me with two queries. Yeah, so there's a couple of queries, I think. I don't know what way. Yeah.
If you want, Stephen, I'll read them out here because they're not visible to everyone.
So I can see one there from Stephen Seawright. That's the first one. Yeah.
Stephen had asked there, can we ask undertakings to self-declare their Article 28.4 aid?
Yes. Well, that's essentially what you have to do. You have to ask them to declare whether or not they've received any Article 28.4 aid from any other public authority. And usually, as I said, in Northern Ireland, that's going to be probably either Invest in I, or there's a possibility it could also be Intertrade Ireland. Down south, I'm not quite sure who all awards aid under Article 28.4, but I'm sure there are public authorities down south that are awarding 28.4 aid. And the important point to highlight again and again is that 28.4 only accumulates with 28.4. So it's GBER Article 28.4. If they've received other state aid under the GBER, that doesn't accumulate. If they've received any de minimis state aid, that doesn't accumulate with Article 28.4. And similarly with de minimis only accumulates with de minimis. So again, these are particular ways these rules work. 28.4 has its own specific ceiling of 220,000 euros. Article 28.4 aid, de minimis, the general de minimis, the current ceiling is 300,000 euros of de minimis.
Barney Toole also asked there, excuse me, in PEACEPLUS, as a private service-only business providing a service to the lead partner, carrying out workshops and clinics to identifying clients for programme, which the lead partner will then provide support. Are we enhancing economic activities? If yes, then UK subsidy control. If no, then no UK subsidy.
Just read that one again. I'm just reading it here down myself. So
yeah.
So if you're a private sector business providing a service to the lead partner, you're also providing information to the clients through the workshops and clinics. Now, this is one of those ones where there can be a lot of discussion about where do you draw the line, and it's the nature of the advice and information that's imparted these clinics is critical to this. So say you had a clinic where you had 100 businesses there, and you're providing them with very general information, the sort of information that they could easily, if they wanted to, get from, the internet or, some sort of public resource by going out and searching themselves. In that type of situation, I would say that is not giving them an economic advantage. That's sort of a general type thing. However, if it's a smaller group, if it's very, very specific information, say it's very technical information about how a particular product works, say you're developing a software product and this is to do with modules that'll allow you to, it's almost like technical knowledge you're imparting. In that type of situation, then I think you are probably providing them with an economic advantage. But I fully accept that there is, many, many different shades of grey between one end of that spectrum and the other. And very often in that type of situation, it is quite hard to clearly identify where to draw the line. And again, it really depends on the nature of the service and the nature of the advice that's being provided in these clinics, and whether or not you can actually, so like a design type thing where you're working with a bunch of businesses and you're giving them what's effectively, bespoke advice to help them design better products to enter a new market, for example, I would tend to go on the side of that's a subsidy or state aid in that type of situation. Like maybe there's 10 or 20 companies in a group that are getting very specialized teaching, for want of a better word, rather than just general information. Hopefully that answers the question, but again, I think in that type of situation, if in doubt, I would call it a subsidy and then would go on to award it in a way that's compliant with either the UK Act or the state rules, and then you're safe.
That is really all the questions in the Q&A. Is there anyone else would like any other questions answered, or anyone who would like to come on and ask anything?
Barney, yes. So can we let Barney give him access? See, can I do this? Trying. I'm not sure, Don, if I can do this or not. Can you do it?
Yeah, you should be able to talk now there, Barney.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Thanks, Stephen, for the last couple of hours. What I actually meant is my company deemed to be having a subsidy in delivering part of the program rather than the businesses that we're working with?
No, because you're being procured.
Okay.
So
no, we were written in as a partner initially with the initial bid.
Right. Okay. See, I would say in that type one, I would say your service is being procured.
Okay.
To be quite honest, I know I have seen some where companies like your own have been presented as being partners in a project, but effectively you're providing a service to the project, and effectively your services have been procured, I would have said. And the question of whether or not you then are actually providing a subsidy to those businesses depends on the nature of your advice, and just, it really is, it really is very fact specific, and whether or not it would actually qualify as being a subsidy or not that's giving them an advantage. And it's a very subjective thing as well, unfortunately. Very hard to be objective about it.
Okay, thank you. From what we're planning to do, I don't think we are the ones providing the information to the companies or the service. What we're doing is funneling businesses into passing them on to the lead partner, and they provide the expertise.
Oh, right. Okay, that's okay. So that, yes, no, you're not then. I don't think you would be providing a subsidy yourselves directly.
No, we're not.
Yeah.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, well, look, I think if there are no more questions, we'll draw it to a conclusion. I appreciate your time and your attention. I appreciate that on a Monday morning, probably better things to do than you know, to listen to all this about state aid and subsidy control. It is unfortunately it is an important area, obviously, because it's important for SEUPB and yourselves that we comply with the legislation. We have to comply with the legislation, and it is quite a dry subject in some respects, because it is literally about complying with the legislation. If there are any questions that come up after this event, if things come up in discussions afterwards that you think you're not clear about or don't understand clearly, then by all means, get in contact and send an email. We'll be sending the slides out later. Fire an email into the subsidy control mailbox, and we will do our best to answer your queries. And don't be scared of asking. I would rather have to explain things, 2, 3, 4, 5 times so that people are clear, rather than leave things in a way which are ambiguous and ultimately could result in errors on down the line, which have implications for SEUPB and the project participants. So look, thank you very much again, and if you're all happy, we'll draw this to a conclusion.
Thank you, Stephen, from SEUPB. We really appreciate it. We'll be following up with the attendees, but we really do appreciate it. So thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel, as well.
No problem. Thank you very much, Deirdre. So yes, thanks again for the opportunity, and yes, no problem at all.
Thanks everybody for attending.